Hi, and welcome back to our series on what's working to engage young people. My name is Hannah Evans. I'm a research associate at Springtide, and with me are Ron Werner and Chris De La Cruz. Hi, you guys.
Hey,
Would you
Hannah.
want to introduce would you want to introduce yourselves and your title at Together Lab? Just to get us started.
Sure. My name is Chris Dela Cruz, and I'm Director of Youth Initiatives at Together Lab.
And I'm Ron Werner. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the co-executive director of Together Lab.
Great. Can you just start us off by telling us, a little bit about what Together Lab is and maybe how it got started?
Yeah, I can maybe take the lead here, and then Chris, if you want to back me up and share a little bit more about the youth components, some of our multi-generational efforts. But we're calling in from Portland, Oregon. Together Lab works around the state of Oregon and Pacific Northwest, out here in a space where a lot of our institutions, religious institutions, government institutions are very fragile. And what we do is we seek to build community power in order to change systems that exploit people and planet. And we do that in really three main ways. So one, we do it through community organizing, building relationships in order to change systems. So we have a base of people around the state that work and walk alongside one another to do justice work in the world. We help incubate and start new initiatives, recognizing that some of the ways that we've done things forever are no longer working. And so we have to experiment a little bit. We need a lab in order to learn and unlearn and practice some new methodologies. And lastly, we host collaborative partnerships, oftentimes with denominations or social movement organizations or nonprofits towards a common goal or common purpose. But in all of that, we really want to create communities where all belong. And so we use community organizing, starting new initiatives and collaborative partnerships as a way to do that. Chris, maybe you want to share a little bit more of some of the multi-generational or youth slice of what Together Lab does out here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for that. And I should share, I use he, him pronouns. And as Director of Youth Initiatives, overseeing an initiative called Youth Solidarity Movement, where we're inviting a multi-generational movement for youth well-being and youth mental health in different parts of the state. And what we're looking to do is to invite young people to be invited into leadership through community organizing, as well as adults to have support as they care for young folks, so that all these folks could find belonging and purpose in something greater than themselves. I, as a young person, like when I was, a teenager, what I needed was just folks who believed in me and for me to believe in myself. And I think that's at the core of what we're trying to do. And to do that from a multi-generational perspective, we say youth solidarity, like young people in solidarity with one another in different parts of the state throughout different schools, as well as adults being in solidarity with them. Yeah. That's what I'll share for now.
Nailed it.
That's great.
There you go.
Yeah. Um, so I know that Together Lab includes the youth collective, but it's not only the youth collective. So I guess I'm curious, like more broadly, where are young people found in the scope of Together Lab's work, and how does the youth collective, I guess, relate to those other components?
Yeah, so I could start, and yeah, young folks throughout the different organizing we're doing are in there helping as we try to organize around folks who need housing. We have churches who are, figuring out how to use their land so that folks could be housed. And, we had some young folks knocking on doors with us as needed, and making sure that neighbors can support those initiatives in racial justice. And just in different ways that they can see themselves as part of a larger movement. Ron, can you think of specific examples?
Yeah, of our kind of base of community, we talk about being multiracial, multi-faith, and multi-generational. And so about a third of our base are under the age of 35. And really where we got into some of the youth work initially was walking alongside primarily Protestant denominations first. The Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the UCC, the United Methodists, and we recognize that out here in Oregon, if you were to total up all of the staffing related to teenagers in those 5 denominations, well, we did actually total it. And it added, if you added all the part-time positions together, it equaled 10.55 full-time equivalency. So that's the entire state if you add up all 5 of those denominations. And so we knew that accompanying youth in this time in their life, let alone responding to the questions youth are asking related to loneliness and mental health, and I know I can volunteer at the soup kitchen and I know I can show up at the protest, but how do I actually make change? In order to respond and accompany them, this was going to need to be a major investment, more than tinkering around the edges. And so that's when we began to bring anchor congregations together in neighborhoods to form ecumenical youth collectives. But those youth collectives, as we learned, were not just filled with people from the churches or Christians. They're folks from the neighborhood. And when partnerships happen in that kind of way, it's amazing to find a purpose and a vision for a neighborhood and a community, and then to begin to discern, well, what is our role within this, either as congregations or congregations alongside partners like Sunrise Movement, or, Chris can speak more to this, a Filipino Youth Center, and beginning to lean in across our differences to foster belonging for youth.
That's great. That's really neat. While you guys have been talking, I was thinking about how like a big emphasis of our project for this research project is about intergenerational relationships. And I'm curious, like what you, in your experience so far, have seen to be some of the coolest things about intergenerational organizing, and also some of the greatest challenges that you've faced.
Yeah, well, one story that comes to mind out of one of our youth collectives is a story in which there were a group of young folks whom had been deeply serviced and connected to a local community center alongside their parents, many of them who were immigrants who came in, many of them Spanish speaking, where there was a preschool there, a food pantry, various ESL classes and services that the service the community for many years. But then that community center had the county and town and school board were basically fighting over logistics of that community center, and it could have been closed. And what happened were the youth and adults and youth leaders and folks from the school board all came together and organized to save that community center. The young folks organized to have kids from their schools, send in letters. They come to various board meetings. And if you can get a high schooler and a middle schooler to come to a local community board meeting, I don't know, there's a win right there, right? And they were able to save that community center through just coming together. And so that was just a beautiful example of when folks from multiple generations come together in solidarity. There are, of course, practical things you have to keep in mind, like, the school board meeting, interferes with homework and all that kind of stuff. And make sure you get rides. But it just shows that, hey, the young folks can be empowered to leadership.
One of the things I'd maybe add is we've been very inspired by some of the work of the Othering and Belonging Institute out of Cal Berkeley. And one of the things they talk about in order to foster belonging, which is really about creating structures of where you're able to co-create across difference. And they talk about the practice of bridging. And so for us, we recognize that given our various identities, and one of those in this case is cross generation, that is one layer of identity and bridging that needs to take place. There are short bridges and long bridges between us. And so for us, it first starts with talking about that. How are we different? Not running from the difference, but actually embracing it. And what we found is when you embrace it, we actually are able to go deeper into our story to be more known, which also fosters belonging, as you know, Hannah, and some of the research that y'all have done at Springtide. So when we know each other, then we can also know how long is this bridge that we have to walk. And when there's a power differential, like an older generation to a younger generation, oftentimes it's helping to accompany them to see, well, this is a little bit of a longer bridge for you. And how do you pay attention to how do we build trust over time, so we can really know one another and show up for one another and build the kind of solidarity that is deep and strong and fosters belonging and doesn't just skip over steps and say we're all the same. We just need to be unified in order to win this community center fight. Actually, what we're finding when we go deeper, we're able to nurture a solidarity and bridge towards belonging in a way that's very powerful.
Yeah, and Hannah, I'll say that research has been really helpful for us already as we've been thinking through how to foster this intergenerational movement for youth well-being and mental health, particularly orienting like our adults, our youth leaders, as well as the coaches and aunts and parents in our communities to really think through what in your research you identify as this belonging process of noticing, naming, and knowing. As we've shared this with folks, it's really, changed and opened our eyes to what could be possible as we work with young folks. It's affected how I've gone about the relationships I have with young folks, and it provides a level of, like, we could do this, and if more and more adults are oriented in building those trusting relationships, how that could change lives. So really grateful for that research.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm so excited to hear you mention it because it is so entwined with all of these other, it's really hard to have an organization that's thriving or working with young people and thriving if you're not also incorporating belonging. It's such a fundamental part of that, right? I'm going off script a little bit because I'm curious about something that you mentioned, Ron, and I know a little bit from our previous conversations that you all work with denominations a little bit as well as organizing on the ground. And I'm curious about the bridge, to use the metaphor you used there, between organizing spaces and denominational spaces, particularly these historically white denominations that you're talking about working with that don't have the same history of organizing that other types of denominations, like historically Black denominations, do in other parts of the country. So I'm curious, what have been some of the what do you wish both spaces understood more about one another as you're working to bridge that language even and concept around what it means to work with young people with two fundamentally different approaches to working with young people that I see in those spaces?
I mean, that's an awesome question. I think Chris, back me up. I'll take a first pass, but community organizing, I'll just start with is, one of those phrases I heard someone say a month ago. Well, community organizing can mean anything, And, because it's just used out there and can be conflated with different lineages of approaching how to make change. But at its core, it is about relationship and relationship, not just transactional, but about building enough trust to act together at a systems level to make change, and to accompany people into their own leadership and agency. And so depending on your identity or depending on your spiritual formation, or your connection to institutions in general, your starting place as it relates to relationship might be different. And so we talk a lot about the practices of organizing, which are relationshiping practices, and unveiling where power lies, good, bad, and otherwise, are about learning and unlearning at the same time. And so there may be some key skills that we're learning as we practice organizing, but we're also at the same time often unlearning the unhelpful or unjust systems that we've inherited, oftentimes through colonization, through white supremacy. And so predominantly white churches and denominations oftentimes have a different work to do than a more marginalized religious community, or for folks who have, been made marginalized by the dominant systems that we find ourselves in. And so what we try to do is, en route to belonging, also create spaces where we can learn and unlearn together. And again, that becomes being honest about where are we starting and how do we build enough trust over time to go deeper with one another and strengthen the multitude that exists in our movement community spaces, but also the multitude that exists within each of us. And that's different work. And it looks different in different parts of the country. I think other spaces where maybe some of the faith denominations and religious institutions are stronger, there are local community organizing affiliates where those denominations pay their dues and they train their members and their leaders. And here, where our institutions or our denominations are a little more fragile, oftentimes what we've seen is they can no longer staff all of their leadership development and formation in-house. And so we become kind of a third space to help accompany a leader-full approach, whether you're learning how to be a leader or speak or give public testimony for the good of the community, or back in your vestry meeting or church council meeting, or synagogue board for that matter. And so that's, I think, those are transferable skills, learnings, unlearnings, practices, and postures that I think also will strengthen the social fabric of our neighborhoods, but also the communities that we're a part of, if we are a part of community. All right, that was a long first pass.
No, I love it. And I want to highlight this learning, unlearning language that you're using, because one of our themes for this project is adaptability. And we talk a lot about adaptability in like a structural, organizational sense. And I do think it's important at that level, of like what programs are working, what isn't working, what can we do away with, what can we create in its place. But I think learning and unlearning is the interactional component of adaptability, of like, I'm going to listen to you and learn from you, and in that process figure out what I need to unlearn, I think is also a part of adapting. And so I love that language. Like, it's making me think about our theme in a new way of understanding like what adaptability is in a relational sense as well as in a organizational sense.
Yeah, there's like a value underpinning of humility in the unlearning. You're saying, I have things that I need to unlearn, and that creates a different posture when you're trying to approach community partners or someone who has had a different life experience than you or is more impacted by injustice than you.
Yeah, and what I'll add is in those organizing practices that you describe and what's inherent in that relational sense is in that listening, you are trying to see what are the hidden passions and interests of each of the folks that you are with, and then trying to tie them together toward a larger whole. Ron, you and I were having a conversation the other day that shed a little bit here about even how organizing can be related and gives structure and meat to other theological conversations that have happened over the last decade around what it means to be missional, what it means to follow the Spirit in the community. What I can see mixing together here is that the way in which organizing emphasizes the relational aspect, the bringing folks together aspect, and the long-term structure aspect. So in organizing, there are campaigns and there's long-term relationships that through power analysis, you do things in a sustained way and in a strategic way, right? It gives structure to the theological ideas we have of following the Spirit in the community, following the Spirit in what's happening outside the walls of the church, and even thinking beyond walls in the first place.
As you all partner with churches on the local level, connecting with young people, what do you wish more people understood about working with young people in those spaces?
Do you have a gut answer?
I mean, the thing that's coming up to me, Chris, is something that you kind of helped lead us in that has been transformative for me, I'll just say. We could ask others if it's been transformative for them. I think it has. But, I talked about our context here, as far as youth ministry staffing goes. But what that also meant is generational, deferred, that there aren't a lot of youth in our congregations, period. And so there's an orientation shift when we're talking about how do we notice, name, and know youth to foster belonging, not just in our church spaces, but in our communities, because we care about responding to this moment in time of mental health crisis, climate anxiety, anxiety around gun violence, so on and so forth, is, shifting the perspective of church folks from, well, I'm going to get this training or lean into these practices of how to notice, name, and know youth in my church community, to how do you map every young person in your life? And that could be your neighbor, that could be your niece, that could be your nephew, that could be your grandkid, that could be whoever it might be. And how do you see yourself as nurturing these practices in order to foster belonging everywhere you can find it? And what's great is oftentimes we have to take off the goal of like, you do that so that youth will join your church or something like that, or you do that so youth will adopt the spirituality that you have. And the shift is, no, we do that because it's going to help youth to thrive, period, full stop. And so where it's been transformative for me is like, I have a neighbor across the street. We've gotten to become friends with their family. I certainly notice their kids and I can name their kids, but do I, within the trust that we have and with good boundaries, am I like also helping to know them, to know that they're supportive neighbors should life get hard, that they can come and we can be there for them. And just, it's changed how I see even my approach to my kids who are 13 and 10 and their friends. Like, yeah, I definitely notice them. I definitely can name them, but do I know them? Do I ask good questions, or am I just like, hey, how's it going? And every time I choose to deepen belonging or lean into those practices, I am being a part of changing the landscape or being a part of a movement, I think, here in Oregon. And that's a shift from, we learn these things so we could do them in our church space.
Yeah, I think what I'll add, and thanks for that, Ron, is a couple of things. One, I think, and I've worked closely with young folks for a number of years, and I think with folks whom I help gather in terms of working directly with young folks as well as in their lives, I think there is this anxiety among adults that they have to be the cool kid in town in order to relate with them. And this may be obvious for many of the folks already watching, but just to say out loud, you know, those young folks, like, they know you're not of their generation, and to find points of relatability doesn't mean having to not be who you are. And in fact, in that bridging, there's actually an appreciation of different experiences. But the key is just, so in that notice, name, and known, in the research, the known part is particularly around whether a young person feels judged as they share about who they are and their life experiences, and that they're more willing to then explore questions of purpose and questions of, paths in life if they first don't feel judged. And so that simple, just actually caring about what they're going through and their perspective in life does make a huge difference, as experienced in your research as well as in our lived experiences working with young folks.
So you're saying that they already know I'm not cool, is what you're telling me. They already know I'm not cool. Which is true. One of the really interesting things about talking to so many different organizations on this project has been how many people say, I'm not cool. Like, I work with young people, I know I'm not cool. Like, it doesn't really matter. And how many people who are struggling to work with young people are struggling because they feel like they're not cool enough. And so I'm curious, like, from your perspective, I'm curious, like, why you think this is such a hang up for so many adults who want to work with young people or want to, why do we, and I say we because I think I'm not that old, but I still feel inclined to do this. Like, I'm a millennial. I don't know what's going on TikTok anymore. Like, why do we feel insecure about this, I guess? Like, what do you think is the desire underneath that?
Well, I think a lot of us remember what it's like to be in middle and high school. And whether we were cool or not, that all had to do with the various insecurities we had, whether we belonged or not, which I think the key is to tap into the core underlying this sense of whether we're cool or not. Like, I sense a bunch of adults are purposely or not suddenly tapping into, like, their insecurities of what it was like to walk into the lunchroom and not know if someone would talk to you. And what would it be like to, as an adult, tap into that, not to see whether a 12-year-old thinks you're cool or not, but rather remember when that was your world, and remember the struggle that was there, the longing that was there, and also the ways when there were, and spaces where there were belonging, remembering the adults that came in your life. Usually they weren't cool, but they sat alongside you. They heard your stories. They were able to see potential in you, and so were able to help you to meet the expectations you have in life, but in a way that was coming alongside them. And I think that's the key there.
Chris,
Yeah,
I wonder.
I love that.
Oh, go ahead, Hannah. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Ron. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wonder, Chris, if next time we were in a room of a bunch of Lutherans a couple of months ago, and we asked them to tell the story of when they were a teenager about an adult where they really felt known by. And it just unlocked something, both like, what are the qualitative components of being known? And I wonder if we would have asked Chris, and they named like teachers and aunts and neighbor. I mean, it was all across the board, the people who played that role, and some pastors too, they named even. But if we were to ask them after, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how cool was that person? I would be very surprised if we had many 3, 4s, or even 5s, if 5 is the coolest. Because that was just not the quality of the story that each of them shared from their depth.
If anything, I think what many young folks, or at least what I was longing for, was the space to be yourself. I think that phrase comes up over and over again. And just to drop like the cool language or not, it's if an adult and a space just allows folks to drop the veneer, that's when young people most feel like, oh, okay, I can be more in my own skin. Because that many of us spend a lifetime trying to grow into that, and the power that we can have just by creating just a little more space for young people to be comfortable into their own skin and to feel like that they belong here, which we believe that they do. Then there's some power in that.
Yeah. And it makes me think of like if in a relationship with a young person, you're so focused on, do they like me? Do they think I'm cool? There's no space left over to actually like be present to the young person in front of you and how they feel about the world, not completely or entirely about you. Like the ability to decenter yourself in that conversation, I think, is like an important skill to have. Yeah. Ron, one of the things you had mentioned earlier was Together lab being in the name. So I'm going back a little bit. And I'm curious about what you all have been, thinking about adaptability in this like larger organizational sense. What it has looked like for you all to sort of like, what's your process? I guess I'm curious of identifying when something's not working and what it looks like to reevaluate that.
Yeah, I mean, this is gonna help me, Hannah, make this sound more exciting. It's going to sound very not exciting at first, but I think one of the biggest things that we provide amidst an ecosystem of organizations who are all doing really great things, but this lab component is like just some infrastructure, actually. So how do you take a adaptive challenge or a problem on the ground that you don't have a ton of funding to address and staffing? Maybe you're able to piece together enough stakeholders and enough funding to not experiment on people, but faithfully lab something with real goals and strategies and evaluative ways to track and measure, so that not just at the end of it, but at every step of the way, we at least get a test in the field that we can learn from as we go. And I think what we found with many labs, like this youth initiative started as a lab at some point, and now we're able to deepen and scale it and look for additional stakeholders and partners, is you learn both what is our sense of collective vocation within this lab. What is the thing that we can do that's missing, that we can address, that someone else isn't addressing already, in order to nurture a space. And so that often leads us to ask, are we persevering here? Are we just going to try something different? Are we pivoting? And it might be with the same group of people, but we're trying a different way, or a way to do it. So like one of the labs we're looking at leaning into this year is we have a lot of faith communities that have food pantries, for example, and do food distribution. And one of the challenges that we're hearing is oftentimes there's a transactional relationship between the giver and the receiver. And so might we work with 4 congregations to look at how could you foster belonging and solidarity and bridging across the giver-recipient relationship? And if you could build that kind of relationship across different lines of impact on our food systems, for example, what might you be able to push for systems change-wise at a state level? Is there a different kind of policy that we might push for? And we're looking at the next legislative season related to a food for all bill working with the Oregon Food Bank as a stakeholder that would provide access for people regardless of documentation status. But, we're not talking about that from like a what's on the headline or from political partisan politics, but we're looking at it now because maybe we've fostered enough deep relationships where we know one another and we know what we might push for together in order to ease, maybe ease is not the right word, to make our world a better place. I mean, really, at the end of the day. And so that's like an example of a lab where we would say, okay, this is a challenge. How do we take some of our frameworks and bring it into a new space and learn from it and accompany a team, these different teams together? And then what might we resource other initiatives? What do we learn from that we can share with the youth initiative? What do we learn from that we can share with folks who are predominantly organizing in immigrant communities? What can we share with our friends who are looking at building affordable housing on land that's stewarded by faith communities? And so the lab and our lab notes and resources that get produced end up nourishing the whole too.
That's very cool. And it's very sociological, which means I'm very interested in, of course. I'm like, the organizational
structure all day long.
Yeah, when
so
you were
great.
like, it's going to be really boring, I was like, I can promise you I will not find it boring.
Yeah, I mean, this is...
But yeah, that's super interesting though. I love that. And a lot of the work you all do is very sociological, actually.
Well, I think it comes down to the belonging is not about sentimentality, and it is about like structures and how we order our commons and our spaces and who gets to be a stakeholder. And when we use words like belonging, it's hard because there could be 100, you ask 100 people, they all might have a different idea of what that means. But when we talk about it, we are talking, creating structural belonging.
I want a tattoo of belonging is not sentimental. That's so good. And when I first started in this role at Springtide, I had a hard time connecting to the belonging language because it felt so like sentimental, I think. And it was hard for me to conceptualize that it's actually connected to all these other things I care about that are structural, that they're fundamentally entwined, and that like there are people who use belonging and are using it in a more sentimental way. But when I think about belonging, and the work you guys are doing about belonging, like it has implications, it has structural implications, and I think that's just a more compelling version of belonging to me. As a social
if you come up with the pithy way to describe it and communicate it, let us know, Hannah.
Right, exactly.
We only have like 2 to 3 minute long
If you made T-shirts
answers.
that said "belonging is not sentimental," I would wear one. I'll be your first T-shirt customer.
Belonging beyond good vibes. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I want to talk about purpose before we wrap up. I know, one of our themes for this project is purpose and really about giving young people a sense of purpose and ownership, which is a huge part of what you all do with young people. And so I'm curious, like, what does it look like what has it looked like for you all to cultivate purpose for young people in your organizing work?
Yeah. Well, in organizing, what we're doing is inviting these young folks into leadership, into sensing that they have a sense of agency, right? Which is part of a marker of real structural belonging, that they have this sense of agency in the larger structures and they have a say, and that they belong, right? And the tension that and that we constantly try to tend to is the fact that with young folks, they are in their becoming, they are also juggling so much, school and just learning about some of these pressures and structures for the first time. I'll never forget at one of our listening sessions with young folks, one of our high schoolers said, we feel like we've learned about this climate crisis, and we felt like the adults in our lives created it and now have lumped it to our generation to try to save it.
Mm.
And so what we don't want to say to our young folks is the weight of the whole world is just
Yeah.
on your shoulders. I think that's a really key component in the solidarity, multi-generational aspect to that. And at the same time, young folks want to be invited to make some sort of difference in that. And so to be invited into something greater than themselves is that sense of purpose, which again, I think what your research has laid out so well is that there's room for that purpose once they have that sense of belonging, once they have those connections. And so in our organizing, when we have young folks who are able to save a community center or to knock on doors for a housing project, or to I think Ron, you alluded to this before. We've heard them say, okay, we know we can do a service project and do direct service. We're involved in these protests, but what can we do to make sustained change? What the invitation in this organizing work has been is long-term sustainable organizing that and change that also doesn't burn them out, that actually helps them with their well-being rather than kind of grinds them to the ground.
Yeah.
Before we did
Yeah.
this, launch this, Beyond the Lab youth initiative, we engaged in a year-long, maybe six months to a year-long listening season alongside these 5 denominations around the state. And, one of the surprise things that I heard that was so powerful were how many adults who, maybe still some say this, like Chris said, like, are leaning on youth to save us, the future generation. Sorry about the mess we made. How many adults and elders had this deep lament of the world that they were a part of creating. And their question to us was, how can we have spaces to make it right? What does repair look like across generation? And that's a powerful piece, because then when you have youth who are organizing for a Wichita center and they're engaging elders or folks from different generations, it's not just about, well, do they agree the center should be saved? It becomes more about, how do I show up as an act of repair to this generation too, because of past harms that we've committed or that we've been a part of, and it's a really powerful and also feels like unexplored territory that we're, I think, excited to get into more in the multi-generational spaces. Yeah, that still sticks with me as something I'm like, whoa, I've never heard that before in all my years of working with youth, of how do I make it right?
Yeah.
What does repair look like?
I love that. And I think that's so important. Yeah. Chris, you mentioned this concept of agency, and I'm curious what it has looked like to, in my research, talking to young people, there's a lot of despair, a lot of like, I feel like I can't do anything. I feel like none of it matters, especially around political issues. What has it looked like, I guess, to cultivate agency in relationships with young people in your work?
Yeah, well, what's been really interesting is that we're at this intersection of organizing and then also spirituality and also mental health. And I mentioned that to your question because often the ways we teach spirituality is around doctrine, learning, and then doing, as opposed to praxis and then making meaning around that. And so as young folks are invited to be a part of making change happen, multi-generationally, there's also the larger hope that is fostered in praxis. And speaking into that hope can be the meaning making that our various faith traditions speak into. And that's, happened on the ground. And it's made so much more meaningful when you have those connections between those trusted adults, when we can speak meaning out of, oh, this is what happens when folks come together, and maybe there's even spirit that's working in that. And so hope and, dare I say, even faith that can be spoken into as we act together is kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, like you said, faith-based organizers have such an opportunity to speak to the purpose that like young people are struggling with, I think, a lot right now. And so it's really great to hear you all connecting the dots on that. And I love that we're ending on hope, because I do feel like it's like not in a cheesy way, but like I do feel like it's grounding, actually. Like hope provides opportunities for accountability and intentionality, right? Not just in a sentimental way, if we're like decrying sentimentality and talking about, meaningful change and healing, then I think hope has to be a part of that. It's the foundation that makes it feel possible. So thank you for leaving us with that. And I hate to wrap up our conversation because I could keep going, but I really appreciate you both taking the time to talk with us and being a part of this conversation. And I'm really excited to add your voices to what this conversation has been so far about engaging with young people. Do you guys have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I'll let you get the final word, Chris, but I would just say something that we're learning and leaning into related to hope is that, or an unlearning maybe, is that hope is not just about the future. Or hope is not what we place when we have a community organizing win. But we actually have to collapse our future and our present and our past in some ways. And hope can be something that's present and where we're making meaning now, and a choice and a discipline, even en route to hopefully more life, or removing obstacles that diminish life in the future. But I think that disentangling of hope as solely something for the future will help us be more grounded today.
Yeah, and I guess to add on to that, when I was I was speaking to young folks about belonging in relation to all of this, and I offhandedly said not just that we belong, but that we belong here, like rooted in place, rooted in community, and rooted in the real lived pressures and experiences that teenagers are going through now. I didn't have all those deep thoughts when I said it. I kind of just said it offhand, to be honest. But it was the young teenager who was in front of me who said, oh, that just clicks. We belong here, like all of us here, and we can make something out of this. And I was like, that's much more profound than I thought I could think up of. But yeah, you're right. Like, we belong here. What can we make out of it? And I think that's the work I think we're trying to do together, and I think could be possible with all the folks who are listening when we put some meat and not just sentimentality on that belonging, but believe that we can do this when we come together.